On This Week in Enterprise Tech, Colby Moore hacks some satellites, and we show you what it takes to build your own municipal fiber network. Quiet on the set.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
Bandwidth for This Week in Enterprise Tech is provided by CacheFly at CacheFly.com.
This is Twit. This Week in Enterprise Tech, episode 154, recorded August 20th, 2015. Build your own municipal network. This Week in Enterprise Tech is brought to you by PagerDuty. PagerDuty decreases alerting noise for IT operations and developers to ensure that the right engineers are notified at the right time. Increase your uptime and sign up for a 14-day free trial at pagerduty.com/twit. Welcome to Twit, This Week in Enterprise Tech. It's the show dedicated to the enterprise professional, the IT pro, and the geek who just wants to know how the world is connected. I'm your host, Father Robert Ballecer, the digital Jesuit, your guide to all things in the enterprise. But of course, I ain't guiding you by myself. I've got my regular cast of characters, starting with I'm melting, Mr. Brian Chee from the Advanced Network Computing Laboratory in Honolulu, Hawaii. Brian, I'm thinking you're not dealing with the air conditioning situation in Hawaii right now, right?
No, I've got fans galore turned on, and it's running about 95 degrees Fahrenheit and about 92% humidity, and I am melting.
Well, this could be an experiment. We're just going to watch you get lower and lower in that seat as all the water just leaves your body. So, folks, this could be a genre-breaking episode of This Week in Enterprise Tech. Cheebert, who's just 4 feet from the sun.
Thanks, Frankie Hippo.
Someone who does have functional air conditioning is Mr. Curtis Franklin over on the other side of the United States. Curtis, hopefully things are better where you are?
Well, here in the cool, crisp mountains of Florida, things are wonderful. No excess heat, no excess humidity. It's just a glorious day here in the wonderful panhandle of Florida. Actually, I'm down on the peninsula, and we're just waiting to see whether we get a hurricane next week. So business as usual.
We may have to do a Twit dedicated to hurricanes. Now, we've got a great show for you. We're going to be having Christopher Mitchell, who's the Director of Community Broadband Networks at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. He's going to be talking to us all about municipal fiber networks. If you've ever wondered why there are not more fiber networks out there run by cities, well, you need to stay tapped. But before we do that, gentlemen, let's go ahead and jump into the blips. This first one is, well, I'm sorry to say, about Flash, specifically how Flash is dead in the enterprise. If you're responsible for a network from Soho to enterprise, it's past time to kill Flash. That's the gist of a Cisco 2015 mid-year security report in which it was announced that the first 5 months of the year saw the successful exploitation of 62 different Adobe Flash Player vulnerabilities. To put that in perspective, that's more than the total annual Flash bug count for any year dating back to 2001, and way more than Java, which hasn't seen a 0-day since 2013. Of chilling note is the fact that Cisco has seen these exploits quickly integrated into exploit kits like Angler, making their availability to even minimally skilled black hats. With that quick integration, Angler is seeing success rates of upwards of 40% of Flash-enabled devices that hit infected landing pages. The report says that much of the vulnerability is because of a non-timely Flash player patching schedule, which is true, but with 62 exploits in just 22 weeks, nobody, much less the enterprise, should be running Flash.
You want the top cloud app? Then you want Office 365. The mobile-first, cloud-first vision is paying off for Microsoft, according to the inaugural Business at Work report from identity and mobility management firm Okta. The report says that Microsoft's Office 365 service has proven most popular among a lineup of 4,000 business apps. The report indicates Office 365 is a clear leader in driving large corporations to the cloud. Now, there are leaders in individual app areas. Box is the most widely adopted content storage app among customers. Amazon Web Services is most popular for infrastructure, and Salesforce wins in CRM. However, overall, it's Office 365. And Okta data indicates that even tech giants can fall to competition. Google Apps, for example, has fallen to Office 365 in almost every category, including email.
The FCC says convention centers can't block personal Wi-Fi. It's in the it's about time category. The FCC has moved to fine Smart City Holdings $750,000 for blocking personal Wi-Fi hotspots in convention centers. Smart City Holdings has since tried to defend itself by saying, "We have always acted in good faith, and we have had no prior notice that the FCC considered the use of this standardized, available out-of-the-box technology to be a violation of its rules," say Smart City Chief Executive Mark Haley. "But when we were contacted by the FCC in October 2014, we ceased using this technology in question." Yeah, right. I don't know about you guys, but $80 a day for convention center Wi-Fi? No. I can see why people aren't using it.
Note to self, test before rolling out. Last weekend, air traffic support across large swaths of the United States was disrupted when the FAA's en route automation modernization system glitched. The system, built by Lockheed Martin to replace the 40-year-old en route host computer and backup, is used at all 20 of the FAA's air route traffic centers across the country. And it has survived some fairly impressive connectivity issues, equipment failures, and high traffic situations. What it couldn't survive was a software upgrade gone wrong. The upgrade was supposed to provide controllers with the ability to customize their screens with frequently referenced data, which worked. But every time a controller changed the settings, the previous settings were kept in memory, a memory leak that eventually slowed the system to a crawl. The FAA claims that proper testing was done before the update, but only if proper means not nearly enough. Hey folks, test before you upgrade.
Lightning never strikes 5 times? Google experienced high read-write error rates and a small data loss at its Google Compute Engine data center in Gislane, Belgium, August 13th through 17th, following a storm that delivered 4 lightning strikes on or near the data center. Emergency power kicked in as planned, but in some cases, the battery backup to the disk systems didn't perform as expected. It's possible that some of the strikes were on utility power substations or telecommunications lines outside the data center, and those strikes affected the equipment in the building. Most data was recovered, but Google reported that, quote, "in a very few cases, recent writes were unrecoverable, leading to permanent data loss on the persistent disk," end quote. Google apologized for the loss in its summary of the incident, saying, "Google takes availability very seriously, and the durability of storage is our highest priority. We apologize to all customers who were affected by this exceptional incident."
The San Jose mayor and council wants to deter thieves from even coming into San Jose by putting license plate readers on garbage trucks. In a move that the San Jose City Council is touting as a way to keep thieves from coming into the city, the mayor and a council person wants to equip city garbage collection vehicles with license plate readers. Their Orwellian plan would mean that every street in the city would be covered at least once a week, and that the data fed back to the police department would be a strong deterrent to thieves. To say that privacy supporters will be looking very closely at how the data is used is an understatement. But the mayor did stumble a bit by saying that they'll likely like to talk to the civil liberties folks before they move forward.
iOS has been losing its enterprise edge. Now, it's been an unspoken truth that iOS rules mobile in the enterprise, but it seems that time might be coming to an end. In Q2 of 2014, iOS controlled 92% of the tablet market, effectively having a monopoly on enterprise mobile. However, in Q1 of 2015, that number dropped to 81%. And year over year, iOS is down a whopping 30.4% to 64% of activations. The reason? Android and Windows. Android has jumped from 15 to 25% year over year, and Windows tablet have seen a bump from 4% to 11%. iOS is still tops in many of the vertical markets, but the lack of strong enterprise management features and the Pro version of Microsoft's hybrids have been meaning that more and more mobile is leaving the Apple enterprise. Well, that does it for the blips. Let's go ahead and introduce the guest for this episode of This Week in Enterprise Tech. This is a topic that we've been wanting to talk about for a while, and that is municipal fiber networks. What does it take to roll out a municipal network? What are the barriers to rolling out that network? And, well, what are the issues you need to consider before trying to propose one for your city? Thankfully, we've got an expert who reached out to This Week in Enterprise Tech and told us he'd be more than willing to fill us in on the details. I welcome Christopher Mitchell, who's the Director of Community Broadband Networks at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. Christopher, thank you very much for coming on to the show.
Absolutely. Thank you for inviting me.
Now, first, Christopher, could you please tell us what is the Institute for Local Self-Reliance and what is the Community Broadband Networks Initiative?
Sure. The Institute for Local Self-Reliance is a 40-year-old nonprofit that focuses on keeping both political and economic power at the local level. This basically means we think decisions should be made by the smallest level of government, the unit of government closest to the people as is practical. And the Community Broadband Networks Project is an initiative we started about 10 years ago when we saw that the internet was becoming a necessity and that local governments had very little power to compel a provider like Comcast to offer fast, affordable, reliable internet access. Whereas in other essential utilities, local governments or some level of government would often have that power to compel access. So we decided that we need to find ways that local governments would have those tools, and basically found that a nonprofit structure, whether owned by the city or a cooperative or something that basically was rooted in the community, would be the best solution.
Christopher, our audience is pretty savvy, and so they've heard, normally through my ranting or Cheebert's ranting, about how we got the system that we currently have. But before we get into the nitty-gritty, can we discuss a little bit of how we got to where we are, specifically the 1986 Cable Communications Act and, of course, the Telecommunications Act? The idea behind those pieces of legislation was to encourage cable companies and telecommunication companies to build out networks for what we have today, these high-speed broadband networks. Now, it could be said that we wouldn't have no high-speed cable, no DSL, no Fios, if we hadn't provided for those companies to have an initiative to invest all that money. But as a result, what has happened? I mean, it seems as if we're still thinking that we're living back in 86 or 92, and our understanding of broadband and competition hasn't really advanced past that.
Well, I think, we've learned a lot of lessons in terms of just how innovative and powerful the cable and telephone companies can be when it comes to figuring out ways of preserving their monopoly. Certainly for long before I was involved in this industry, we've seen attempts to encourage competition or regulation to ensure better behavior, at the very least, a level of access and an investment that would support all the other industries that depend on it. But we have not seen that. And one of the lessons that I've drawn away from that is that trying to find solutions at the federal level ultimately is necessary in some cases, like in network neutrality. But when it comes to actually encouraging investment, we need to take action at the local level, where I think Comcast is a little less powerful and people and local businesses are more powerful.
All right, let's go ahead and get local here. I want to hold off on some of the political talk because I want to bring that back up when we bring my co-host back into the conversation. But what, in a test case, let's say I've got some backing. Let's say I've got the will of the people in my small municipality saying we would like high-speed fiber. We have been ignored by AT&T. We have been ignored by Comcast for decades and decades, who always seem to be saying, we'll get there, but never do. What are the roadblocks that I will face as I try to push forward? Where will I meet opposition? What will be the biggest points of contention?
Well, I think one of the biggest roadblocks, let me start with the most obvious one. There are some states that say you can't do it. So that's an easy one to get out of the way. We list about 20 states where they have regulations that range from thou shalt not to what we call a leprechaun riding on a unicorn bill, which says you're allowed to build a broadband network as a community, but first you have to find a leprechaun riding on a unicorn, which is to say it's very impractical and not going to happen. So if you live in one of the communities that does not have the more punitive regulations, then one of your biggest challenges will be a sociological problem, I think. You specified a small town, and I think that's smart, because in towns of less than 50,000, we see a different dynamic where people are more trusting of their elected officials. And so what we'll see is elected officials will start to educate themselves on this, perhaps at the prodding of a local business or activists, or even the initiative of the city manager or something like that. And they'll start moving forward, and they need to figure out how to borrow money, which is something local governments can almost always do, or they can engage in a more incremental process, which would take a lot longer and be lower risk. But there's a lot of options out there. Fundamentally, the challenge is actually political will. So, you sort of step by that, but that is the biggest problem, which is, do the people support elected officials taking action in this matter?
That is interesting. So the biggest roadblock is political will. We, on this show, we brought up the fact that there are a lot of legislative roadblocks that the FCC has been attempting to do things like, for example, opening up the polls to competitors. But if the biggest roadblock, the most substantive roadblock, is political will of the people, how do you change that? Because I understand what you're saying with the small city, large city dynamic. In a small city, yeah, you're more likely to trust your local officials because you probably know them. You've probably had something to do with their decisions. As you get to larger and larger municipalities, you get this really interesting dynamic where I trust corporations before I trust the people I put into office. How do I fix that?
Well, I think that there's a number of ways. One that I recommend is actually starting smaller. So we have a situation in the city of Seattle where they've just done a study and decided that it is too risky to engage in competition with Comcast by building a citywide fiber network that would offer a gigabit. And I think that's a reasonable reading of the results of the study, although I think it's not as extreme as the study may have presented. What I would counsel Seattle to do, in the event that the mayor believes it too risky and city council finds it too risky, is to take some smaller steps to engage in some pilot projects, or to start building in just one section of town with a more modest approach to prove that they can do it. It's a nice thing to do in terms of sort of getting up the learning curve before you're serving hundreds of thousands of people. If you can start with a neighborhood and learn a lot of the lessons that you have to learn only by doing. So I think that, in some ways it's like inching into very cold water. That's one path. Other paths are, to some extent, just demonstrating power, which is to say to elected officials, you need to be more scared of us, the local businesses and the residents, than you are of Comcast or AT&T. And that can take, just sort of rallies, petitions, all those sorts of things together, not just a petition by itself, but really organizing and making sure people are motivated to be writing, talking, showing up at campaign events, doing whatever it takes to say, this is a big priority for us and you need to take action on it.
Christopher, there's another element here that I'd like to talk about, and that is when we talk about a municipal network, we're talking about a publicly funded network, and another one of the obstacles that we're going to find in gaining that political will is convincing everyone in that municipality that everyone should pay for this. And it's always been the case, especially when we get to local politics, which is, well, if I don't use broadband, I don't see why my tax money should go towards it, or I don't see why a bond should be issued to lay out a network that I'm never going to use. Do you still find that? I mean, I find it very difficult to step out of the box in which I live. And in the box that I live, I can't think of anyone I know or anyone I deal with on a daily basis who wouldn't see that as a common good, who wouldn't, even if they're not always using broadband, everyone I interact with understands why that makes it a better city to live in. Do you still run into that, or have we gotten past that point? Is broadband now like the telephone in the old days where you just say, yeah, everyone should have one?
Well, it varies from community to community, but the trend is definitively in the direction of the world you're living in. I think it is a misconception that taxpayer dollars have to be used, but then you adroitly pointed out that, a bonding issue. So the city of Lafayette, Louisiana, one of the best internet networks in the United States, they're very forcefully will say, we did not use a single taxpayer dollar to build our network. They did bond using revenue bonds. Private investors funded their network and are being repaid by revenues from it. But that's an argument we could have about sort of at a higher geek level about how the funding works. But there's other places like Santa Monica, California, where they had a bill of about $1.3 million a year to serve their own needs, the schools, the city facilities, and that sort of thing. And they said, well, what if we just took, 500,000 of that and we built our own network and we started serving ourselves? And they did that. They found that they had higher capacities at lower prices. They reinvested the savings and they kept expanding it. And they also got some grants to do some other expansions. And they've just continued to expand the network. And that's a way to move forward without using taxpayer dollars. So there are some ways of doing it over a long period of time. But we really do see a lot of people, Republicans, Democrats, independents, saying, just solve this problem. If my taxes have to go up a little bit, then that's okay. And that's not a universal statement, but we've seen it in a number of places. And in fact, some of the areas that are the deepest red in rural America, and particularly a county like Rio Blanco in Colorado, they're just spending taxpayer dollar on a network to encourage competition. So, it's not a universal truth that people do not want to spend taxpayer dollars on it. But I will say, most elected officials are afraid that they'll run into that. And so I think elected officials are far behind the public on this matter.
All right. Now we've addressed, or at least started to address, the whole idea of getting public opinion on your side to move the hearts of the people who are actually going to be affected by the measures the most. I'd like to move on to something that's very closely related to it, and that is, I'm just going to call it out, the dirty pool that's being played by some of the incumbents, some of the bigger ISPs. There was one story that I really like because I think it's one of the clearest examples of how incumbents can play with local politics to prevent the passage of municipal networks. There was a small city in the tri-state area in Illinois. Now, they were ignored year after year. This was that city that for 20 years had been promised by both Comcast and the local telco that they would come in, they would install fiber. It never happened. They were limited to modem speeds. So they put onto the ballot a municipal fiber bond. They were gonna have it be a voluntary program. They weren't gonna put any tax money into it. It was gonna be purely voluntarily funded, but they were going to roll out fiber to the city and give high-speed access to all the residents. Our early polling for putting up this bond measure was high. It was 77% 2 weeks before voting. So it was one of these, this is gonna pass. Now, right before the vote, flyers started showing up at all the addresses for all the homes in the city from a committee that no one had ever heard about, and it was, let me spell out what this is going to mean. And it spouted facts like every municipality that has ever tried to roll out fiber has failed and cost the taxpayers millions. The flyers claimed that the broadband initiative would cost millions every year just to keep up the network. And it was using facts from the telecommunications industry to show you exactly how expensive it was to run your own ISP. And along with the flyers, suddenly a bunch of paid newspaper stories started appearing that showed that the citizens of the Tri-County area firmly oppose this bill. As a result, in 2 weeks, it went from 77% favorable to 80% unfavorable, and the motion passed. Motion failed. Now, they were never able to connect that advertising and those stories back to Comcast, but most people are assuming it was Comcast. How often do you hear stories like that?
It's fairly frequent, frankly. There's There's those stories when it comes to public votes. There was a push poll that was commissioned in Lafayette by the Cox, the cable industry, which was led by Cox, in which they asked questions like, since the water restricts you to watering your lawn on certain days of the week, are you worried that you would not be able to watch television or use the internet on certain days of the week? Which is kind of a comical question. But they also ask questions designed to inflame racial tensions between the areas of the city that were more of the African American concentration and lower income, which was really disconcerting. That might be the dirtiest, most horrible thing I've seen, just in terms of cynicism. We've seen in Longmont, Colorado, which now has one of the lowest priced gigs in America because the city did do it. But Comcast spent over $500,000 over 2 referendums to convince people to vote no. And it's an interesting dynamic where in the first referendum, people were swayed by the Comcast propaganda. But then afterward, they started asking questions like, wait a minute, what really happened there? Why were we listening to Comcast's argument? And so 2 years later, they had the referendum again, and it was a landslide in favor because the community was prepared for it. So it's not always the case that those dirty tactics are effective, but the industry will use every opportunity and every tool at its rather large disposal to try and stop competition. That's true of local governments getting involved. We see very similar tactics with private companies that try to come up and compete with Comcast or Charter. Price discrimination that the federal government and the state's attorneys general do not sort of crack down on and investigate because it's so hard to prove. There is a real intimidation of elected officials. And we see that when a network does not when a network does not succeed. There's a few networks that I think we would agree have failed, that when that happens as a result of Comcast or Charter or another cable company putting a lot of pressure on them, it really scares all the other neighboring communities away from doing something, which unfortunately encourages them to just double down on these dirty tactics.
It's interesting that you say that the second time that referendum went around, they were prepared for it. And I think maybe that's the reality we live in. If we want to pass these legislative solutions to poor broadband, you actually have to think about preparing the community for what they're eventually going to get. I'm thinking of 2 questionnaire questions that people actually sent to me. They sent me clips from questionnaires that they received while their cities were trying to pass municipal fiber bills. The first one said, experts have said that a lot of broadband on the internet promotes addiction to porn. Are you comfortable with your tax dollars being used to promote porn? And the second one was, along the same lines, there is a growing number of hate groups on the internet. Do you support the use of your tax money to give these hate groups more publicity? And it's just as simple as that. It's putting a little bit of a no into someone's head and getting them to associate something with the worst thing possible. If that's how this works, and we now need to consider informing the electorate, how do we do that? How does that become a campaign of, well, this is probably what you're going to hear in the next couple of weeks. Here's how you should respond to it.
Well, I think that was what I think of as the vaccine approach, preparing them. An answer that I sometimes give flippantly might be, you have no idea what's transported on your public roads. If you're concerned about that, or taxpayer dollars build roads, and trucks use them to move all kinds of manner of things, from illegal drugs to pornography to who knows what, and we don't stop investing in roads. Telephones have been used to commit fraud. So I think there's that. You can definitely try and do a vaccine, but one of the reasons that my organization really likes organizing around this is I think it's a real opportunity to try and help people to think about these things more deeply. We're in an age where I think a lot of people are influenced by what they see on TV. And I think in 50 or 100 years, people will be less susceptible to just believing things that happen to show up on television. And I think we have to help people to just think more broadly about who they trust more, their local government or a big corporation that's headquartered in Philadelphia or Dallas. And, for some people, they might say, well, I really don't like my local government and it doesn't work very well. And my answer to that is generally, if you have a local government that does not work well, it probably shouldn't build a network. The first thing you should do is get its house in order and then it may want to look at building a network.
All right. I want to bring my co-hosts into the conversation because they've been a big part of talking about municipal networks on This Week in Enterprise Tech. Chee, let's start with you. One of the decisions that we think didn't get enough exposure because it was in the same day that the FCC decided that they were going to adopt the new net neutrality rules was the FCC decision to open up the polls. And that was huge. That was one of these decisions that we are hoping will spur competition. Have we seen competition because of that?
Well,
no, I think.
Christopher,
I apologize.
I want to bring in Chee here first.
Yeah, I certainly have seen a lot of conversation about additional competition because the polls have been opened up. And there are certainly more plans being spoken about in back rooms. Have I started seeing anything in the greater Honolulu metro area? No, not yet. But the possibility, because of that deregulation, means that if I wanted dark fiber, it's now possible. And what I'm really and truly hoping is Hawaiian Electric bonds fiber optics to all their high tension lines. And while the pole change in regulations doesn't directly affect that, it does creep open the door a little bit that there should be competition from places other than telecom carriers, because Hawaiian Electric actually was trying to lease dark fiber way back, and then the Public Utilities Commission, quoting FCC regulations, shut that effort down.
Christopher, what about it? And have you seen across the country any ripple effect from that FCC ruling?
No, I think there's still a lot of complication when getting on polls. But fundamentally, even if we had a world where it was very easy to get on polls and this problem was solved, I'm afraid that that would not solve the problem that I'm trying to solve. And I think a lot of people are trying to solve, which is making sure that everyone has internet access, much like just about everyone has electricity. I think a world in which there's we solve the problem with the polls is a good one for geeks, for very high-tech type people who are willing to figure out, I can figure out a way of getting dark fiber to my house and work with an ISP in such and such an arrangement. But it doesn't change the fact that the business model for connecting everyone is very challenging. And it fundamentally involves going head to head with a company like Comcast that frankly does not have a lot of worry about a cop on the beat to stop its anti-competition tactics. So, when I look at opening up the polls, states that have done a better job of that than others, we just don't see more investment from the cable and telephone companies than we saw in states that have not done as much on that.
Let's talk a little bit about that. If your mission is just to connect everybody, it seems like that would be a rather straightforward mission. I mean, I don't see why anyone would say, no, I shouldn't be connected. Does it come down to a matter of fairness? Because this is one of the things that Comcast, AT&T, and Verizon have said time and time again. Anytime they feel like they're under attack, they say, well, we just want there to be a level playing field. The government is trying to uneven the playing field. We've done all this investment. We want it to be fair. But is it fair?
The FCC chairman, Reed Hundt, who was active in the early 90s and I think made a number of decisions that a lot of us think really helped to make sure the internet developed the way it did. He said a lot of people came into his office talking about how they wanted a level playing field, but he never found a single person that wanted a level playing field. Everyone says that they do. It sounds nice, but fundamentally, the job of a Comcast lobbyist is not to create a level playing field. They would get fired if they did that. Their goal is to maximize their own opportunities. So, I would say that people like me try to encourage a level playing field, but I certainly have an ideological point of view, and I think people should suspect that and check it out. But no, there's no one that's in the industry side that's trying to figure out how to enable more competition. Fundamentally, if Comcast's executives thought that they should encourage competition, the shareholders would revolt, and rightfully so. Comcast's their mission in life is to maximize shareholder revenue, and it's a system that I don't think is necessarily bad from that angle. And I'm not going to say that is in itself an indictment, but the idea that we should be taking public policy advice from them is lunacy.
Curtis, I want to bring you in on that point. There's two distinct issues that I can see there. The first is this idea of the level playing field and this idea of universally connecting everyone. Why wouldn't you be able to get support for universally connecting everyone? What's the holdup there? The second thing is, as Christopher was saying, these lobbyists are trying to create the maximum amount of revenue for their companies. Is that necessarily a bad thing? I mean, shouldn't they do that? Isn't that their responsibility? Where do we shift from saying, well, this is what they did with their capital, they should be able to do what they want to do, to you're no longer supporting the public good?
Well, I think that's where we get into the difference in the responsibility of business and government. The responsibility of business is, in fact, to maximize shareholder value, which tends to mean increasing revenue and minimizing their costs. So, yes, the lobbyists are doing exactly what, in most cases, the law requires them to do. The thing is that there really isn't anything about the public good in the corporate charter of pretty much any business. That's what government's for. And there has to be a balance. And where we see problems are where government has, for one reason or another, abrogated its responsibility, where it has said, you know what, it's a variation on the old what's good for GM is good for America. Well, what's good for the company is by definition good for society. And I think we've seen that that's not necessarily true. Do we want to make sure that the one value that most guides society is maximizing the profit of companies? Many of us don't think so, but that's why we need to hold our elected representatives at various levels accountable for the decisions they make. It's all a game of who can make their voice heard in the most effective way, whether it's the companies with their lobbyists or citizens individually or through their lobbyists in organized fashion.
Chee, I want to draw you into the conversation a bit. I know that you had previously written to me about Congress possibly looking at broadband access the same way that we used to look at lifeline access for the telephone.
Yeah, well, actually, I threw a URL into the doc, and basically the FCC has actually started conversations about doing a vote to add internet connectivity in the same category as Lifeline telephony support. So, brief explanation. Lifeline is the concept that no matter what income class you're in, whether you can afford it or not, telephone connectivity is so important that you can apply for Lifeline, which means you get it free of charge no matter what. The FCC and Congress are saying that there is so many public services, so many social services that are only now available on the web, that internet connectivity should be lumped in the same category as Lifeline telephony. Ought to be really, really interesting. I don't think that vote has happened yet, but if it does happen, that's going to be an amazingly interesting wake-up call for the incumbents.
Christopher, I want to throw that over to you. Let's talk about the incumbent issue. It's very easy to demonize the incumbent. It's very easy to look at Comcast and say they're playing dirty pool, or look at Verizon and say, well, they're just using the power of their monopoly to keep out the smaller players. But again, isn't that their job? Isn't that what they do in a capitalist system? Don't you try to press your advantage? Where do you see in your ideology? Where does the right of a corporation and of the individuals in that corporation to push for more profit meet the responsibilities that they have to the public good?
Well, I don't know that I believe corporations have a tremendous responsibility to the public good. I think individuals do. They certainly should not be engaging in immoral behavior on behalf of corporations. But it's a very complicated question. I tend to think the job of a good government is to set up the rules in such a way that corporations are able to compete well without conducting immoral or illegal actions. So one of the things that I would encourage would be where local governments build out networks that are open to multiple competitors, in effect lowering the cost of entry for entrepreneurs and small companies that right now find it very difficult to get the capital to build a network to compete with Comcast. Now, the interesting thing is that if you want a local government to build a gigabit network without using any taxpayer dollars, then the business model will probably be one where the local government offers service. But if we build our networks more like the roads, where we use some user fees, what people pay on a bill every month, as well as some general tax revenue, that's the way our roads actually work, then when you build a fiber optic network that way, you can enable competition because you're not restrained by just trying to maximize profits in the way that the private sector might. And what I'm getting at is that I think for a number of people, they say, we don't want to use taxpayer dollars. But the odd result is that I think in many cases, you can use taxpayer dollars to basically say a homeowner is going to pay an extra $20 per month on their tax bill. We're going to have that homeowner have a lot of choices among providers, including Comcast, AT&T, but also any other entity that wants to compete on the public network. And because of that competition, I think their telecommunications bill is going to go down by a lot more than $20. In many ways, I think that's the best approach. But as long as local governments are afraid of using taxpayer dollars, we're limited to, in some ways, replicating the cable model of a monopoly type approach, which is what I think many libertarians most oppose.
Christopher, you're running out of time here. I know we have to let you out very, very soon. But there are two questions that I want to bring up. The first is, we hear a lot about these municipal initiatives that fail. Do you have any stats on how many actually fail throughout the country and how many have succeeded?
Well, it's very difficult to say definitively whether a network has succeeded. And that's because if you have a network, and this isn't hypothetical, we've seen this in southwestern Minnesota, a network that came within $50,000 of breaking even with where the business plan called for them to stop running in the red and to start running in the black, which ordinarily takes many years, in the order of 3 to 5 years. They did not make it. They came in under because they had built out outside of town to a local employer that was going to leave town without it. So they decided that rather than hitting their target of running in the black, that they would keep, these 12 jobs in the community. You find me a local elected official that would not make that trade. I call that running in the black. That's a success. That's also a value judgment. So I think our research at the Institute, which we publish regularly on muninetworks.org, along with news stories about this stuff, suggests that well over 80% of these municipal networks succeed. Actually, when you take an incremental type approach, which is the lowest risk, the success rate, as far as I can tell, is 100%, because there's so little that can go wrong when you basically know how much you're going to be saving and that sort of thing. But the citywide type approaches, we've seen some privatized. We've seen some that are never going to pay off their debt. And that failure rate is under 10% from what we can tell. And even in those cases, there may be situations where, like in Provo, they lost millions of dollars on their network. On the other hand, people have had much lower telecommunications bills. And now Google operates it, which there's a lot of cities the size of Provo that would pay that same loss just to force Google to come in. So, it's basically a value judgment. And I trust the intelligence of people that are evaluating this to look at it and say, just because Chattanooga is still in debt doesn't mean that they're a failure. In fact, they're scheduled to pay off their debt early. So that's a sign of success.
One last bit, and that is, why are we only talking fiber here? Why don't we talk about wireless? Why isn't that considered in a municipal rollout?
Well, I have to take a little bit of blame, I think. I love talking about fiber. I love that it's long-term. I like that knowing that, to the best of our knowledge, in 20 years, it's still going to be fiber networks. So people like me really like fiber. We like the certainty of it. But there's a lot to be said for wireless. And frankly, the decisions that the FCC is making right now on spectrum in terms of opening up more unlicensed space is incredibly important for making sure there's going to be more great wireless. But all of the wireless that's being developed is going to require fiber optic backhaul. And, I think of wireless as a means of sharing a great connection. You've got a fiber optic connection in your neighborhood. And, right now, you might be sharing Wi-Fi, your wireless connection with your people in your household. If you're on an LTE network, you're sharing it with a heck of a lot of your neighbors. The more people you share it with, the less good it's going to be for each user. So we're not expecting wireless to replace fiber. We're expecting fiber to deliver high quality connections to fixed locations where it will probably be distributed to people over wireless. But, we see these really great hybrid solutions in places like rural Minnesota where the community is building out via a co-op that they've created fiber to towers to bring wireless to people this year. And then they're going to build fiber to them over the coming years to make sure that they have something today, but also something that will scale in the long term.
Christopher Mitchell, the Director of Community Broadband Networks at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. We want to thank you very much for spending your time with This Week in Enterprise Tech. Fascinating subject. Would you mind if we invite you back at some point? I'd love to have you on a panel with a few of the ISP folks that we know here in the San Francisco Bay Area. I think it would make for a fascinating conversation on the future of broadband.
That would be terrific, and I think I'll be in the Bay Area. I visited your brick house maybe 3 years ago. I'd love to come back and do it in person.
You are more than welcome back. Now, if you could please tell the folks who are playing along at home, where can they find you? Where can they find your institute? Where can they find more information about your project?
Sure. The main place to go is muninetworks.org, which is MUNI, short for municipal. I'm also on Twitter @CommunityNets. And I think another great place is ILSR.org for Institute for Local Self-Reliance, where it's a little bit easier to find a lot of our reports and fact sheets and things like that. So those are the 3 great places to find me.
Christopher, we thank you for joining us on This Week in Enterprise Tech, and we send you off into the ether.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Now, when we come back, we're going to be bringing you over to Black Hat DEF CON. Brian Chee and, of course, Brian Burnett, the Cranky Hippo, and myself were at Black Hat DEF CON, and we had a chance to look at some very interesting research from a man by the name of Colby Moore who, well, basically insulted everyone who uses satellite internet. But before we do that, let's go ahead and take a moment to thank the sponsor of this episode of This Week in Enterprise Tech, and it's PagerDuty. Now, what is PagerDuty? PagerDuty is the best way to make sure that your issues are handled before they turn into problems. PagerDuty is an operations platform that delivers visibility and actionable intelligence to help increase the uptime of your apps, servers, websites, and databases. It connects all of your systems into a single view, allowing you to see critical events across all your monitoring tools. It's an essential service if your business needs your software and services to always be up. It has over 100 ready-to-use integrations, including Nagios, New Relic, Keynote, AppDynamics, or you could roll your own with PagerDuty's APIs. You can customize it to fit how you and your team work, rather than the other way around. Here's how it works. When there's an incident, PagerDuty will first look through all your monitoring tools, filter and deduplicate the alerts, and then only will it alert the proper staff. Now, this reduces noise and false alerts and makes sure that only actionable alerts are delivered. After reducing that noise, PagerDuty will check on-call schedules and personalized alerting preferences to automatically alert the right team member and the right time. Now, those alerts are dispatched by automated phone calls, SMS, email, and push notifications, and it's distributed across multiple data centers and multiple hosting providers, so your people will never miss an alert because of a failure. If alerts are missed because that person's just not checking his or her messages or for whatever reason, PagerDuty will automatically escalate the issue to another team member until it's responded to. All of this means one thing. You can resolve incidents on the go while living your life, even when you're on call. PagerDuty is trusted by thousands of companies, including Microsoft, GitHub, Boeing, Nike, and Box. If they trust their business with PagerDuty, shouldn't you too? Get the right engineer on the right problem at the right time. Visit pagerduty.com/twit to sign up for a free 14-day trial. And for as little as $19 a month, you can increase your uptime with PagerDuty. And when you sign up for a new account, you'll also get a free t-shirt. That's pagerduty.com/twit. pagerduty.com/twit. On Tuesday, August 25th at 10 o'clock a.m. Pacific, PagerDuty is having a free webinar on IT incident resolution in the enterprise. As IT organizations are getting larger and more complex, the tools and processes to manage incident responses must be able to scale. In this webinar, they will discuss best practices and share insights into how successful IT organizations are meeting the challenge. You can register now at pagerduty.com/webinar. That's pagerduty.com/webinar. And we thank PagerDuty for their support of This Week in Enterprise Tech. Well, let's get to it. This is a presentation that I actually very much enjoyed at Black Hat DEF CON. We bring in Colby Moore from CINAC, who researched a vulnerability in the Global Star satellite network. I'm Father Robert Ballecer, the digital Jesuit, here at Black Hat 2015 in Las Vegas, Nevada. I'm standing next to Mr. Colby Moore from CINAC, who, well, Colby, you found a very interesting, I'm not going to call it an exploit, I'm just going to say an engineering failure in the Global Star system. Can you explain a little bit about what that's about?
Yeah, that's correct. So I was looking at this Global Star system, initially just at the consumer-based products, but I found the technology in the system is used kind of across the board in both consumer and the commercial and even military products. But basically, this system is used to report, it's kind of like SMS for the remote monitoring world, and none of the data in the system is being encrypted over the air at all.
Now, it's not just that it's not encrypted. There's also no authentication. Essentially, anyone with a radio on this frequency can start pinging it.
Yeah, precisely. Anyone with a radio tuned to this right frequency with the right equipment can listen in and sniff this data. And furthermore, they can even, if they're malicious, they can go inject data back into the network to report false sensor readings or false locations or things like that.
Just a while ago, you had a chance to speak with members of the press. We sat down after your big presentation, and here were some of the more interesting tidbits.
Yeah, there's been a lot of talk about satellite hacking, and I really wanted to take a stab at it and see what I could do. So I was familiar with a company called Global Star, and they have a variety of services, be it cell phones, but they have a service that they call the Simplex Data Service that I was very interested in. And it's used, kind of gained its popularity recently in consumer products by a subsidiary called Spot, and they make personal locator beacons, so if you're out in the wild traveling, you're in an emergency, you press the button and search and rescue will come find you. They also make low-cost asset trackers, so you put it on your yacht, on your car, and if it's stolen or you just need to keep track on something, it'll show you where it is anywhere in the world. So the way these devices work is they actually use a simplex data link, meaning one way. So it's only device to Global Star. The device is actually a little puck, the size of about a hockey puck, and it has a GPS receiver, so it gets its location from the GPS satellites, and it relays that location information as well as other metadata in a packet up to Global Star, and then Global Star sees that location. I started looking at the service, and I realized that the data is sent using a spread spectrum technology, and a lot of my research was going into how to despread this data, decode this data, and figure out, kind of the unique key that lets you look at this information. Well, I found out that the data is sent really in clear text over the air. It's not encrypted, and I was able to pull out the whole data packets and data formats. And I was able to see that there's no encryption. I was able to, in the case of asset trackers, determine which fields in the packet correspond to an asset's location, the GPS coordinates, or other things like that. And so I also found out that there's no encryption and there's no signing on these data packets that's going over the air. So any attacker that's listening is able to decode this information and view whatever information is being sent over this network. And then furthermore, because there's no encryption or signing, we can also inject our own data back into the satellite network. So transmitting on Global Star's frequency is illegal, and I don't want to get myself in trouble, so I'm still researching the legality of actually injecting data back in the network. But what I did is I wrote the code that would be able to inject data in the network, and I compared the signal exactly to the signal that comes from one of the devices. And I was able to replicate the signal 100%, so I can say with 100% confidence that I can inject data back into the network. I did find a vulnerability in one of their tracker devices that lets me modify the ESN, the electronic serial number, so I can actually use software to modify one of their devices and then use that device to inject data back in the network legally. So I can actually spoof devices on the network, and I could trick what data is being sent back. I can use this device to listen over time and kind of watch locations of different assets come by. I recently did some research at a conference called ShmooCon a couple months ago, where I tracked users using vulnerabilities in mobile dating apps. And I tracked users over many, many days. And you can develop what's called a pattern of life. And so you watch where someone goes over all times a day, and you start to see patterns. This is home, this is work. And so I was able to do the same thing with these devices, sniff data over there, and say, hey, this is an armored car carrying bank shipments. It's, it originates here and it goes here, in the same time every day. And so as an attacker, you would know, hey, this truck is here on the same route, I can go, hey, hijack it. I'm looking for exact numbers, but I think there's many millions of these deployed in both consumer and commercial goods. They're used in a lot of fleet tracking for cars, big oil and gas tracking, the SCADA systems, military systems, and basically any simplex data network service device that's operating on this network is vulnerable to this attack as far as I can tell. So I believe anything that uses a service is vulnerable. I think the real vulnerability here is, yes, that there is no encryption. The data flying over there is in plain text, and the fact that someone can inject data back into the satellite network. I think it was really design trade-offs that led to this decision. It was designed a long time ago when satellite bandwidth was expensive, and adding encryption or the extra overhead could incur costs, and really security wasn't the forefront of people's minds. But going forward, there's no excuse to not add this on now. My background isn't in RF reverse engineering and things like that, so I wanted to keep this pretty cheap. And part of the goal of my talk was to provide my research to the hacker community so we can look at the other satellites out there. I think a lot of these systems are vulnerable and architected the same, and so we'll find a lot more of these things going on. But I used what's called an Edis Research USRP, a software-defined radio. It cost about $600, about a $50 Global Star antenna off of eBay, and about a $150 amplifier is really the base components that I needed. So for really less than $1,000, I was able to begin sniffing and analyzing these satellite systems. This is my interception capability, kind of proof of concept. I have an antenna and then the software radio inside that will let you, I had it running in my hotel room last night aimed at the airport, and you can see what's going by. But you guys can come up and take pictures and play with it after. So the range isn't too long. I've been getting about a mile out of this. So I got my private pilot's license so I could go fly this thing in the air. So I've been flying this thing around trying to intercept data on the uplink. I've been putting it on top of buildings and trying to see what I can see. I need a little more money for future research, but given a big enough antenna, actual proper amplifiers, you should be able to see for several hundred miles. Actually, the satellites orbit at about, I believe, 500 miles, and so these devices that only use about 0.2 watts of power are able to talk that far using the spread spectrum technology.
Colby, what can they do about this? Because obviously there needs to be some encryption. Obviously, these are not satellites that are easily upgradable, so we're really looking at next generation for a permanent fix. But in the meantime, what would you expect out of Globalstar and any carrier using these satellites?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Going forward, I think Globalstar can actually layer some encryption on top of the system, but it'll be a little bit of an effort, but it's actually feasible at this point in time. Previously, I think they were reluctant for maybe some reasons like, satellite bandwidth overhead and things like that. But going forward, it shouldn't be an issue. And as a consumer, just know that using this device, you might be able to be tracked, or people might be snooping on this information. So act accordingly. I think, and hold these manufacturers to a high standard, and, ask to know, how is my information being sent? Is it encrypted, and how so?
Colby Moore from SYNAC, we want to thank you very much for speaking with us. Could you please tell them where they can find you or your company if they want to find out more information about this research or your future research?
Yeah, for sure. Our company website is synack, SYNACK.com. And my personal Twitter is at Colby Moore, COLBYMOORE. We'll be posting updates all the time, so be sure to check us out.
Father Robert Ballecer, the digital Jesuit from Black Hat 2015. Chee, this is actually a story that we've really been talking about for a couple of years on This Week in Enterprise Tech, because we've been talking about SCADA devices, and a lot of those SCADA devices have been linked up via satellite, actually through the same satellite system that Colby was doing research on. And it always struck us that this data is not encrypted, and that those SCADA devices predated the internet by a decade or more. So, of course, they were never designed to be connected to a network as large as the internet.
Yeah, well, SCADA in general is just used for control. And, if you've got a device, say a valve, way the heck out in the, boonies someplace, you want to be able to go and at least get the status of that valve. And so the original designers said, okay, well, I'm not going to let anyone control the valve. We just want to know whether or not, we've got water or whatever flowing through it. So we actually don't care. And that's the biggest problem. A lot of the designers of these original systems didn't really care whether or not someone would be able to see that data. Because for the most part, you couldn't control them. That has changed. A lot of new systems, a lot of new embedded systems are now bidirectional. I'm actually starting to use Iridium. Iridium's actually got more bandwidth, slightly more. It's still short messages, but one, they're signed. Two, there's enough payload that I can actually encrypt data. And it's bidirectional so that I can send data back and forth, so I can actually control devices that are sitting on buoys way the heck out in the middle of the ocean. But yeah, SCADA was never designed to be on the internet. It's basically a dumb serial device, and a lot of SCADA devices are so sensitive and so old, and TCP/IP or whatever was so last minute, so after much of an afterthought that some of these devices I've actually sent. If I sent 10 pings in a row, you can actually crash some older SCADA devices. So this is one of the things that I want to warn a lot of people about is, for God's sakes, if you are going to be playing SCADA and you are going to be putting it onto something that is inherently not terribly secure, at least for God's sakes, use a more modern SCADA device that has the ability to actually sign its own data sets, or encrypt some of its data, or for God's sakes, at least encode it in a way that you can embed a signature. It's not that hard. It's not rocket science. You can do it on really, really small. Even micro Arduinos are capable of doing this now. So SCADA can be secure. It just, a lot of people just aren't taking the effort. And I got to say, bad on you.
Curtis, the interesting thing about this research is Colby tied it together with some prior research that he had done at ShmooCon, where he was able to take publicly available data that was just being surrendered by applications, specifically dating applications, and he was able to track people throughout the conference and be able to make analytical jumps about who they were hooking up with and whose circles they were a part of. That's the kind of information that's being surrendered in this vulnerability. If you're an enterprise, and you're an enterprise that deals with shipping and you've got assets all around the world, if you're using this system, it means that you're now giving someone big data points and big data analytic powers into the inner workings of your enterprise. It seems to me that that's something that should be a lot scarier than most people seem to think this hack is.
Well, certainly, if you are in any kind of manufacturing business, this is a huge deal because most companies keep their supply chain very tightly controlled, and information about that supply chain is considered highly proprietary. So by allowing the possibility for their competition to know what's being shipped where, who's moving where, they really do give up an awful lot of competitive information. As you say, if I were in manufacturing, especially in a highly competitive business, I would be looking very carefully at this and working very hard to figure out alternatives or solutions to make sure that my supply chain info stayed proprietary.
Gentlemen, I want to thank you very much for being part of this episode of This Week in Enterprise Tech. I will say that we could continue to talk about Colby Moore's research. We could continue to talk about the Global Star hack, but I don't want to because actually next week, Colby Moore will be our guest, so we'll be able to ask him in person about his research and where he intends to take it. Stay tuned. That's a little hint for all you folks who are downloading this. Next week, next Friday at 1:30 p.m., we're going to be having Colby Moore from SYNAC on This Week in Enterprise Tech. But back to my two favorite co-hosts of an enterprise show. You are part of the best dang enterprise show in the universe. That's according to 9 out of 10 security researchers. I want to give you time to please tell the Twiat audience where you will be, what you'll be doing, and hopefully what you'll not be doing, which is melting. Cheebert, could you start with you, please?
No big change. I'm just hoping to actually get back to work next week. Sitting at home melting is kind of a drag. But if all goes well, I'm going to be finishing up a Aircom Access Now story that I've been writing, and that's going to be kind of interesting for those of you playing with the VDI world. The Aircom Access system should be looked at as an alternative to Citrix NetScaler.
There we go. We look forward to that story. Curtis Franklin from Information Week Radio. Of course, we always want to check in with you and find out what the Twiat Riot should be listening to. What programming do you have coming up?
Well, Padre, one of my big things is coming up this next week on Tuesday at 3 p.m. Eastern. We've got a great radio show with Elliot Mazie, who is an expert on enterprise learning and training. He's also a Broadway producer, just a generally really interesting guy. That's going to be a great show. Again, that's 3 p.m. Eastern. Information can be had over at informationweek.com. I've also got some stuff that I'm writing. I'm working on pieces that range from a roundup of 10 different packages for building applications, if you're not a programmer, to in-depth looks at how the U.S. government is using data to track, analyze, and fight the wildfires out west, and how NOAA is using data to build the models that it uses to track hurricanes. So lots of good stuff, both in print and in radio coming up. For all of that, please follow me at KG4GWA on Twitter.
Cheebert, Curtis, always a pleasure. And as always, we couldn't have Twiat without you. Of course, we also can't have Twiat without you. And for the people who are listening to the audio version, I'm actually pointing at you right now through the camera. That's right. If you didn't watch and download each and every single episode of This Week in Enterprise Tech, we wouldn't be able to do the show. We wouldn't be able to geek out each and every single week. So we want to do something for you. We want to make it easier for you to get this show onto your device of choice. Just go to twit.tv/Twiat. That's TWIET. And you'll be able to download every single episode, all of our back episodes, along with our show notes. And you'll also find a little drop-down menu so you can subscribe to get This Week in Enterprise Tech in the format of your choice into the device of choice. Also, don't forget that we do this show live every Friday at 1:30 p.m. Pacific Time, live.twit.tv. Join us, and if you watch live, jump into our live chat room at irc.twit.tv so that you can be part of the conversation. Also, don't forget that you can find me on Twitter, twitter.com/PadreSJ. If you follow me there, you find out who we're going to be having as a guest on each week of This Week in Enterprise Tech. You'll also be able to suggest topics and guests for future episodes. It's a great way to converse with me. In addition to that, you'll be able to see what I do when I'm not on the Twit TV network, which is mostly playing with Doges and flying quadcopters. So, again, twitter.com/PadreSJ. Lastly, I want to thank everyone who makes this show possible. Of course, to Lisa and to Leo for letting us do This Week in Enterprise Tech. To Carson, my super producer. And, of course, my fantastic, absolutely wonderful technical director, Mr. Brian Burnett, the Cranky Hippo. Brian, where can people find you on the Twit TV network?
Well, they can find me TD in a variety of the shows, but more specifically, I'd say hosting Know-How with you. And on our last episode, which happens on Thursdays, we made our own air conditioning kind of unit, a swamp cooler. I told Brian he should make one of those, but he pointed out that the humidity already in Hawaii is so high that it wouldn't make much of a difference. So, sorry, Brian. We'll have to come up with a better system or something.
Next week. We've got it next week. That's right. If you don't want a swamp cooler, if you live in an area with high humidity, you got to watch Know-How next week because we're making a localized Peltier cooler for your body. Yeah, that's right. We're cool like that. Until next time, I'm Father Robert Ballecer, the digital Jesuit. And remember, if you want to know what's going on in the Enterprise, just keep twatting.